Hello class and welcome to week 5 of History and Systems of Psychology. This lecture video will serve the purpose as to going over your assignment for this week, as well as reviewing your learning activities for week 5. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So the first thing that you'll have to do for this week is of course read chapter 8. You will also have a couple supplemental articles on Carl Jung and Alfred Adler, which we'll discuss more in the lecture after I explain your materials for this week. You'll also have 2 videos on Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. I believe the first one, I'm not sure how long that is, but the second one is about 40 minutes. So just be prepared for that. As well as you have a website review over Sigmund Freud and C.S. Lewis. Lastly, you'll have your discussion board posts, and that is over Freud and Lewis. And we'll talk a little bit more about Freud once we dive deep into chapter 8 lecture materials. So for this week, you'll have a project, and it's sort of similar to your first PowerPoint project that you completed. However, it definitely needs a lot more detail and information. And I was kind of lenient on last project assignment because it was the first assignment and a lot of the slides needed more thorough information. So I want you guys to remember, whenever you're doing a PowerPoint, it's so easy to get caught up in that idea of, I don't need that much information because it's just a PowerPoint, because that's what you would do in similar situations if you are presenting this PowerPoint presentation. However, considering the PowerPoint presentation is sort of like a mini paper, those slides need to be filled with lots of information and always citing your references. So a couple of things I did notice with last week's assignment was that there was no source citation within the text or on the PowerPoint slide. So please remember to include that. This is very, 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 very important to avoid plagiarism. I know I dropped a couple points, but next time, if that does happen for this assignment, I will be docking a lot more points. I just want to give you guys a heads up on that. But overall, you did a great job on that PowerPoint presentation. So if you could just continue going the route that you were on that assignment, you should do great on this. So let's dive deep into what exactly you'll be talking about. So after last week, we talked about behaviorism, and this week we'll be talking about psychoanalysis. So that's the main tenets of this assignment. So what you'll need to do is talk about the main ideas, the ways of conceptualizing and treating disorders, as well as historical antecedents and preceding philosophies and intellectual development of each theory. So what this means is, in speaking in terms of behaviorism and psychoanalysis, you'll need to research and review what are the main tenets of behaviorism and psychoanalysis. Who are the finders? What do the theories believe? What are the techniques and traditions that they use to incorporate healing with treatment? Specifically, as it mentions, you'll identify key figures and tenets of behaviorism and psychoanalysis. 1 slide per theory. You'll also discuss the views the theory has on the development of disorder. So when you see that word etiology, that means the development. How does it begin? How does it start specifically in people? So also their approach to diagnosis. So if you're speaking in terms of maybe aggression in children, how does behaviorism address this diagnosis? How does psychoanalysis address or approach this diagnosis? Also, you'll include the views on prognosis for diagnosed individuals. So how would you say specifically that this person, what are the symptoms that this person needs to have this diagnosis, basically, through the lens of behaviorism or psychoanalysis? It also should include at least 1 slide evaluating strengths and weaknesses for each theory. So strengths and weaknesses for behaviorism and strengths and weaknesses for psychoanalysis. And also, if you have any additional questions, if you're not too sure on some of these talking points, please feel free to reach out to me and I can explain to you in the best way that I can, so you can have all the clarity that you need for this assignment. Let's see what else. And also comparing them to a Christian worldview. And also to as well incorporate a little bit more of visual aid, including charts, pictures, graphics. You guys did a great job doing that on your last assignment, so if you continue that, you should be great. So this presentation should be no less than 8 slides long, and that's excluding the title page and reference page. So totality speaking, you should have a minimum of 10 slides, 8 of them being content, and the other 2 is title and reference page. But if you think about it, this is a lot of work. So I'm assuming it's probably a little bit more than 8 slides long if you want to get all of your talking points in. Of course, you should include support and citations. And this is another thing too. You'll need 4 outside sources. So you'll need 4 journal articles. And that is not including the textbook. So you can include the textbook, but that would be 5 sources. So I'm looking for 4 journal articles to include and talk about these theories and specific tenets of these two theories. So that will be, like I said, you cannot use any web page articles for a source. It needs to be clear articles that you found on Google Scholar or through the portal in the library on CalValtis website. So that is important. And the pictures and illustrations should be included to enhance, and we discussed that already. The slides should indicate a good understanding and development of each theory. And of course, APA formatting. So that's the sources within the text of the PowerPoint slide, or at the bottom right hand corner, symbolizing that slide is referenced from that specific source. And this presentation is 100 points. So as I mentioned before, you will be able to have all the information you need, but I want to go a little bit deeper. And I always like to go into the rubric just to give you a little bit more background information so you know exactly what I'm looking for. And this rubric tells you everything that you need to know. So let's see. So it's similar to last week's assignment. So it's 60 points for the bulk of the assignment. You'll also have 25 points for APA formatting and 15 points for creativity. So just be mindful of that. A lot of the points are, of course, on the content of the assignment. So with that being said, I think that's all I want to talk about in terms of the PowerPoint presentation. As I mentioned before, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, please feel free to reach out to me. And we can discuss those in length if you have any questions. So let's jump into the presentation. So this week we'll be talking about Chapter 8, and of course it's the birth and development of psychoanalysis. So last week we talked about behaviorism and those things that are contributed to operant conditioning and classical conditioning and things like that. So this week we'll be talking about, of course, psychoanalysis. So there's a couple of things that I want to touch on. So the birth of psychoanalysis, and that is contributed to Sigmund Freud, and he is one of the main contributing tenets of psychology today. Of course, he probably did not anticipate that his theories and his methods would be amongst the most influential and controversial in psychology's history. So there's a few cases and studies that he contended to. So of course he had a book in 1895, and it was a study on hysteria. And this book was basically a careful guide for therapists to collect and gather data for therapy, specifically for cases of hysteria and psychology-related illnesses and things like that. So his main tenets were, they were to collect the reported reflections, they were to analyze them and interpret them to the patient. So, and typically today, this is what we normally do whenever we see patients. We collect the symptoms, how they developed, and all these things in order to gather information and have a little bit of background information so we can analyze them, review them, and then, of course, we interpret those symptoms to the patients. We interpret, why this may have developed, what can stop them, things like that. So this process is fairly similar to what we do today. And he wanted to focus on understanding The resistance is by using, occurrences and experiences to focus on catharsis. And what catharsis is the releasing of previously caged up emotions. So I know you've probably heard that word or seen that word a few times. So that is exactly what it means. So an expression of emotion. And Freud began to call this psychoanalysis. So I'm going to skip over to the main components because I know you guys have a lot of work to do this week. As always, I always like to keep the videos short. So another key component that Sigmund Freud is responsible for is the id, the ego, and the superego. And you will constantly hear this throughout whatever psychology course that you guys take, because it is a big, big, big part of psychology today. And so what Freud came up with this theory is that an individual psyche is made up of 3 levels. The first being the id. And this is the most primitive part of personality. And it contains the biological drivers. And this is the part that's responsible for seeking immediate gratification of its impulses. So this typically is along the lines of when you are a baby and whenever you want something, and you immediately want that soothing response. The next one is the ego. And this is the portion that makes a compromise between the id and the environment. So this is basically your reality principle. So like I mentioned before, the id is that, immediate gratification, whereas the ego takes a little bit of a backseat on that immediate gratification. And it dives into your consciousness and the more, if you say, reality of every situation. You're not always going to be able to get that instant gratification. So the ego is responsible for that. And then lastly is your superego. And this is the moral guide of the unconscious features. And this guide tells us what we should and what we should not do. So your psyche is made up of these 3 levels according to Freud. Let me see. So that's all we're going to talk about on Freud. However, the next person that was key in psychoanalysis is Alfred Adler. And Adler was actually a follower of Freud, who eventually later disagreed with some of his theories and ideals, and he ultimately developed the theory that's known as individual psychology. So this leads to the question of what else did Adler do professionally besides therapy? So as I mentioned before, he is the founding father of individual psychology. However, he was also an Austrian doctor and therapist. He is often remembered for his concept of the inferiority complex. Excuse me. Which differs from Freud's theory of how our unconscious and subconscious mind has 3 different psyche theories: the id, ego, the superego. He believed that the major part of the information that developed into the personality is based on our inferiority complex. And that, excuse me, and that basically is, consisted of feelings of not measuring up to the standards. Also, so a person that may doubt and have uncertainty about themselves. And it also represents a lack of self-esteem. It's often subconscious, and is thought to drive afflicted individuals to overcompensate, resulting in spectacular achievement or extremely asocial behavior. And that's typically what Adler thought in terms of his inferiority complex. And essentially he wanted to provide therapy that would avoid that process. So here's a couple charts about Alfred Adler. And also Carl Jung was a major influencer in psychoanalysis. So he was also a student of Freud. His legacy is constantly rediscovered and reevaluated into today's psychology. So you have something so-called the Jungian theory, which is based on the premise of self-regulation. It's also composed of tensions between opposing attitudes of the ego and the unconscious. In many cases, he turned to ongoing, symbolic communication from the unconscious in the form of dreams and visions. So he typically, whenever he would dream or have visions about something, he would take that as unconscious thought, and he would have that be, your centering focus of treatment and therapy, and having you, self-regulate and be able to self-soothe through the process of, specifically speaking, if you have anxiety or depression and things like that. So here are a few of early transition of psychoanalysis with Carl Jung. So I'll let you read that. I don't want to read every single component. So here is something that's very important, specifically speaking in terms of your assignment that's due at the end of the week. So what were the goals of Jungian therapy? So the first goal was to teach patients how to learn their neurosis. And I spoke about this, and neurosis is typically, self-regulation. So he mentioned that patients do not necessarily cure their own neurosis. It's exactly the opposite. Neurosis provides a cure to patients who acquire the skills to understand it. So in an attempt to eliminate neurosis from his patients, he would, as I mentioned before, require them to engage in self-regulation. So the second goal of Jungian therapy was balance restoration. So using the concept of energy conservation, Jung believed that mental energy in us is limited. And if we pursue one activity, other activities receive less energy. And this is ultimately true. That's like having, say, for instance, if you have 4 kids and one of them is a little bit more needier than the other, that child is going to receive the more attention than the other kids. So he put that in terms of how we are in life. Say, for instance, if your marriage is struggling, when you have a big promotion coming up at work, your marriage is going to receive a little bit more energy than your work activities will. So that's ultimately what his thought process was. And lastly, the third goal was individuation. So this is pursuing tangible goals or essentially results such as getting into graduate school, receiving that big promotion, things like that. So individuation is the process of fulfilling an individual's potential by integrating opposites into a harmonious whole, by getting away from aimlessness of life, the condition most of his patients were suffering from. And that's psychopathology and disorganization, and sanity and harmony. So those are the key tenets. And another key area of discussion of Jung was the discussion of extrovert and introvert, which is really big because, of course, like we mentioned before, personality and behavioralism and psychoanalysis go hand in hand, because ultimately being an extrovert, introvert determines whether what your personality type is. So I think this is an interesting discussion on those two tenets. And that concludes this week's discussion. I think that there's a lot to learn, still to be learned about psychoanalysis and behaviorism. However, I think that there's so much information out there. There's so many things that contribute to who we are as people and our personalities. And I think it's important to take these key theorists and psychologists and previous history of what we learned and apply it to modern day times. So I think that's pretty much all I want to talk about. And like I said, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, please feel free to reach out to me. And let me know if you have any questions on your assignments, and I will talk to you later. Have a great week.